القدس أرض من وعاصمة من؟ وما مصير هذه الأرض المقدسة؟ وهل ستبقى أرضا مقدسة لجميع الديانات السماوية؟ القدس ومصيرها من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. العهد القديم، العهد الجديد، اليهودية، الصهيونية، الإسلام، المسيحية، فلسطين وإسرائيل. مفردات لها دلالات مختلفة وكلها أثارها القس في الكنيسة الأسقفية الإنكليزية الأب كولن شابمن في كتابه أرض الميعاد لمن؟ حول الصراع بين إسرائيل وفلسطين على أكثر المدن شهرة في العالم، كما وصفها الجنرال الليمبي القائد الذي دخلها على رأس القوات البريطانية والقوات المتحالفة في 11 من كانون الأول ديسمبر عام 1917. الصراع على القدس ليس بجديد، فهذه المدينة تعرضت لحصار مدمر 20 مرة، ودمرت مرتين تدميراً شاملاً، وأعيد تشييدها 18 مرة، كما انتقلت من ديانة إلى أخرى 11 مرة. هي مقدسة عند اليهود والمسيحيين والمسلمين، وذلك بسبب ارتباطها بأنبيائهم والدور التاريخي للمدينة. ومع ذلك فإن السؤال الأصعب يتعلق بموضوع السيادة. من الذي يجب أن يسيطر عليها سياسياً؟ هل الإسرائيليين الحق في الاستيلاء عليها إلى الأبد؟ أم أنه من الممكن التوصل إلى صيغة تحقق إلى حد ما التطلعات القومية والدينية لكل من الإسرائيليين والفلسطينيين، لليهود والمسيحيين والمسلمين؟ الصراع على القدس ما زال محتدماً منذ عام 67، ومنذ اندلاع انتفاضة الأقصى في أيلول سبتمبر عام 2000 وبناء الجدار العازل، بدأ أن الصراع بات خارجاً عن السيطرة، حيث تعمل إسرائيل جاهدة على طمس معالمها التاريخية والأثرية. القس شابمن الإنكليزي المتخصص في الدراسات الإسلامية والمعروف دولياً في مجال حوار الأديان، ماذا يخبرنا عن السلام المفقود في مدينة السلام؟ Reverend Colin Chapman, welcome to our show, The Inside. Actually, sir, your books, Whose Promised Land and Whose Holy City, they carry seismic titles. Can you tell us, please, about the context in which you've written these books?
Well, Zainab, I've lived for 18 years in the Middle East in 3 different spells in different places. I first went to work in Egypt in 1968 and was there for 5 years. So I arrived in Egypt just a year after the Six-Day War in 1967. I was there during Nasser's funeral, and I can vividly remember watching his funeral in the streets of Cairo. During that time in Egypt, I married Anne, who was working as a nurse at that time among Palestinians in Jordan. And it was through my wife that I first began to understand what the Palestinian problem is all about. So I was in Egypt for those 5 years. Mm-hmm. Then in 1975, my wife and I and our 2 children went to work in Beirut. So we arrived in Beirut just 6 months after the civil war, the Hawadis, had started. So there we were in this situation, wondering, what is this civil war all about? And I had to do a lot of reading and talk to a lot of people.
Excuse me, where were you situated during these events in Lebanon?
When we first went out, we were living in Suq al-Gharb, up in the mountains. Mm-hmm. We also lived for a time in the village of Kafr Shima, near the airport. But for the rest of the time, we were living in Ras Beirut, beside the Menara, beside the lighthouse. I was working with students, Christian students mostly at that time. So there we were in the middle of the civil war and trying to understand what it was all about. And gradually we began to understand that it was the Palestinian presence, the presence of so many Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, that had upset the balance between the Muslim and the Christian communities and led to this horrible civil war. So in that context, I was also reading books that Christians were writing in the West, in the UK and in America. And to me, these books that these Christians were writing really didn't make sense in the context of the Middle East as I knew it and understood it. So I wrote an article for a Christian magazine in the UK once, and there were so many angry and critical letters after.
Why?
Because some of these Christians did not agree with my interpretation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So because of that, I decided that I had to do more research and more homework, and eventually I wrote the book Whose Promised Land in the early 80s in Beirut. I can remember writing it in our home, very often with the sound of gunfire in the evenings. So that was the context in which I wrote this book, and it was published in the UK, first of all, in 1983.
Mm-hmm. And what is the message of Whose Promised Land?
The basic message of the book is directed at Christians in the West, mostly, but it's also intended for any people of any faith, Muslims, Jews, or people of any faith, who are interested in trying to understand how the history and the politics on the one hand are related to the religion and the theology on the other. Mm-hmm. So in Whose Promised...
I will ask you further about this, but I just need you here to focus a bit more on the message, as you said, on the audience. And did you manage to get the message through?
I hope I managed to get the message through, because the book has been revised many times and has been reprinted. So there has been a demand for the book, and the latest edition of the book was in 2002.
Right.
It's also been translated into a number of different languages, French, German, Danish, and Arabic as well. It was published by a Muslim publisher in Beirut a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So the first part of the book is simply trying to explain how the State of Israel came into existence. So many people in the West, and Christians especially, are extremely ignorant about the history, the politics, what actually led to the foundation of the State of Israel. So I had to tell the story of Zionism, the ideas of the early settlers and what they were hoping to achieve, the feelings of the Arabs as they realized that these people coming in wanted to set up not only a Jewish homeland, but some of them also wanted to set up a Jewish state. And they could see that the Jews wanted eventually to outnumber them and also have power over them. So it was so important to explain the history, what led up to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and all the conflicts that have followed since 1948.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, sir.
But the second part of the book is tracing the theme of the land through the Bible. Mm-hmm. So the book is called Whose Promised Land? And so the idea is, right, who does the promised land belong to? So we have to start in the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, in the very first book of the Bible, in Genesis, in the Torah, God gives a promise to Abraham. I'm going to make you into a great nation. You're going to be the father of a great nation. I'm going to give you the land as an everlasting inheritance. I'm going to be your God, says God, Yahweh, and you will be my people. So there's a special relationship established with the people. And the fourth part of the promise, God says, through you, all peoples of the world shall be blessed. So this is the basic idea, that God is going to work through the history of the children of Israel as they live in the promised land. Now, the Jews, of course, have looked back to this promise as a promise that gives them a right to the land, a divine right to the land forever, ala tul. Mm-hmm. And so, as Jews were persecuted in Europe in the 19th century and they longed for a homeland, they naturally thought that the place where they could have a safe haven, where they could be secure, would be in Palestine. And so they longed for the day when they could establish a homeland for themselves in Palestine.
Are there any other parts of the book that in which you refer to in continuity to what you explained before?
I've tried to explain that in the Old Testament, God says to the Jewish people, to the children of Israel, if you're going to live in the land, you've got to obey the Torah, you've got to obey the law. If you disobey the law, I'm going to kick you out of the land. And this is what happened. The children of Israel disobeyed the covenant, they broke the covenant, so God took them into exile in Babylon. Mm-hmm. But he also said to them, if you repent in your exile, I'll bring you back to the land. So these are some of the ideas that are very, very important in the New Testament. But then I have to try and explain how Christians read the Old Testament. And so for Christians, it's very, very important to read the Old Testament through the eyes of the New Testament. So we have to ask, how did Jesus interpret these promises and prophecies about the land in the Old Testament? How did the followers of Jesus, the apostles, interpret these promises? Mm-hmm. And when you look at the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of the apostles, it becomes very, very clear that for them, the land no longer has any real significance, because all these promises and prophecies are fulfilled in the coming of the kingdom of God in Jesus. So this is the important idea in the teaching of Jesus, the coming of the kingly rule of God.
Yes. Now allow me to move to your other book, Whose Holy City? What is also the message of this book?
In a sense, you can say that the whole of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is focused in Jerusalem. All the religious issues are focused so clearly there, because you can see why the Jews want to hold on to Jerusalem. You can understand why Jerusalem is important for Christians, and it's important also to understand why Jerusalem is important for Muslims. So all the religious issues between the three faiths are focused clearly in Jerusalem, and it's so important to understand why the people of these three faiths have particular feelings about Jerusalem and want to have access to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. But if you look at Jerusalem, you can also understand how the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians has come to such a head, to such a climax. Because if you see what has been happening in the Judaizing of the old city, the building of settlements around Jerusalem, you begin to see the political game that Israel has been playing in the land as a whole, but it's very much focused on Jerusalem. And that is why the city of Jerusalem brings this whole conflict, the religious aspects and the political aspects, very, very clearly into focus.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me just go back to the origin of the idea of the Promised Land.
Again, it's found in the book of Genesis, where God makes this promise to Abraham as the ancestor of the people. And so through him, the promise is given to the children of Israel. I'm going to give you this land. I'm promising to give you this land as a gift. But as you live in this land, you've got to obey the law. Yes.
Okay.
There's also a very important verse in one of the books of the Torah, where God says, the land is mine. So God says, the land doesn't belong to you, the children of Israel. It doesn't belong to anybody. It belongs to me. It belongs to God. And you, the children of Israel, are but tenants and sojourners in this land. You don't own this land. I'm giving it to you for you to look after for a particular purpose.
Why is Jerusalem, Reverend Chapman, so important?
Because
I mean, the Israelis, they were trying their best to try and coerce all the Americans to move their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, so that the other European countries will follow their course, so as to declare Jerusalem as their capital.
I think the reason is that they have been insisting that they must have exclusive sovereignty over Jerusalem, that Israel, having conquered it in 1967, must have exclusive sovereignty over the city, and they're really not willing to share it with anybody else. And they're trying to do it partly for religious reasons, but partly also to make the point that they really want to be in control of this area. And they're not willing to share sovereignty. They're not willing to share sovereignty over different parts of Jerusalem with the Palestinians.
Right. More focus on the contents of your books and your research, but we have to stop for a short break. A short break and we'll be back. Stay tuned. Welcome back, Reverend Chapman. Now, how does your approach help people to come to grips with political issues, to think about them and understand them?
Well, in the first place, as I explained, the books are written primarily for a Christian audience. So these Christians really need initially to understand the history and the politics. But then it's important to put their theology and their biblical interpretation on one side in order to address the political problems as they exist at the moment in Israel-Palestine. The problem for so many Christians in the West, and I'm thinking particularly of Christian Zionists, is that they don't understand the history. They haven't actually understood the history. They start with the Bible, and they make connections between the promises and the prophecies in the Bible and things that have happened. So they start with the Bible and therefore find it difficult to understand the history and the politics. So the very first thing I'm trying to do is to help people to understand the history and the politics and how we have arrived at this situation of intense conflict. But then I'm trying to help people of all faiths, Jews, Muslims and Christians, to understand how people of the other faith approach the problem. So it's important that Jews try to understand how Muslims think of the problem. It's important that Christians understand how Jews use their scriptures to relate to the politics. So we really have to understand our own faith and the faith of others as well. But having understood how others use their faith to relate to this particular conflict, I think people of all faiths have got to say, look, if we're going to solve this problem, we cannot solve it on the basis of our religion. We have to put our religious beliefs, as it were, on one side. So I'm not denying what I believe as a Christian. I'm not asking a Muslim or a Jew to deny what they believe about the land and so forth. But I'm saying that if we are to find political solutions to this conflict, we have to understand the religious beliefs of others and then put our religious beliefs on one side and tackle the problem on the basis of international law and human rights.
How easy do you find it to balance history and politics with theology and the Bible as related to this conflict?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I have developed my approach as a response to Christian Zionism. And this is an approach that I personally feel is profoundly wrong. It is profoundly wrong in the way that it interprets the Bible. And I would say that it leads also to some very disastrous practical consequences, because it leads to a totally one-sided approach in supporting one side in the conflict. So I've had to develop my approach as an answer to Christian Zionism and try and show how this is not a good way to approach the problem. So over the years, since I've been studying the problem and living in the region, I've been reading up about the history and the politics, and many of the books that I read these days are all about the history and the politics. I'm reading a book at the moment written by a Jewish writer about the significance of the year 1913. Some of my main sources actually are Israeli Jewish historians. They have spelt out the whole story, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, the Nakba, very, very clearly. So I've been reading the history and the politics.
And they are still Israelis?
Absolutely, absolutely. There are many of these historians who really do understand what happened. and are very sympathetic to the Palestinian telling of the story. So on the one hand, I've been reading up about the history and the politics. On the other hand, I've been looking at the Bible and trying to work out how to interpret it. And in the end, it seems to me that the way that I've approached it really does make it possible to bring the history and the politics and the Bible and the theology together in a convincing way. And it gives us a way of approaching the problem with a real hope of suggesting solutions.
Now, would Jerusalem ever become the capital of Israel with its Jewish identity the way they want it? And if so, what is going to happen to other religions in this sense?
Well, this is where I personally believe that the West and the world in general, and the United States in particular, at some stage needs to stand up to Israel and say, you can no longer claim exclusive sovereignty over Jerusalem. For historical reasons, for demographical reasons, and for religious reasons, the Jews have to recognize the claims of the Palestinians. So because of history, because of demography, and because of religion, the Jewish people must recognize that Palestinians have a very, very strong claim to this particular city as well. And there have been many people who have suggested ways of dividing the sovereignty so that parts of the old city would come under Israeli sovereignty, parts of it would come under Palestinian sovereignty. Parts of Jerusalem on the west would come under Israeli sovereignty, parts of it on the east would come under Palestinian sovereignty. It really is possible. There have been many plans put forward, but it means that the rest of the world has got to put quite a lot of pressure on Israel and say, you cannot go on like this. You cannot go on insisting on exclusive sovereignty over the city. It's got to be shared.
According to many specialist archaeologists, there is no Jewish history for Palestine, and that whatever is said is just counterfeit and incorrect. What do you say, Reverend?
I'm afraid this is where I think I have to disagree with you, because it seems to me that there is plenty of archaeological evidence that supports the history and the stories that are written in the Old Testament. From the time of David onwards, and even before that, there is plenty of evidence from archaeology that seems to support the story as it is told in the Old Testament. And so what we're dealing with here, I'm afraid, is that both sides have used archaeology for political ends. And I suspect that sometimes Arabs, Palestinians, use archaeology for political ends in the same way as Israel, as Jewish Israeli historians, have sometimes used archaeology for political ends. So the whole subject has been politicized.
As everything related to this issue of the conflict.
Yes.
Now, they say that the Palestinians have no right to go back to their homeland. So what is the fate of the Palestinians in this sense? You have like more than 1 million Palestinian refugees scattered across various Arab countries and the globe too. And in a country like Lebanon, as you live there and you know, that there is no settlement of these Palestinian refugees. So what is going to happen with them?
This is where we have to go on and on talking about international law, because international law is so absolutely clear that refugees have a right either of return or of compensation. And one of the problems in all the conversations, the peace negotiations that have been going on in the last 20, 30 years, is that Israel has refused to put this subject on the agenda. It's postponed it.
Sure, because you said that it's a matter of demographic fear.
Yes. And this is where the rest of the world at some stage has to stand up to Israel and say, look, this conflict has got to be solved on the basis of international law.
Yes, here now I just need to focus on some issue that even in the media they refer to certain kind of legitimate and illegitimate settlements. Now, do you think that this is true, that there is something which is legitimate settlements and another illegitimate settlements?
In my understanding, there is no such distinction. Israel would like to make some distinctions in order to claim that they have withdrawn from certain settlements. But if you accept the principle on which United Nations Resolution 242 is based, the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, it is absolutely clear that in international law, every single one of those settlements is illegal. And most of the world recognizes this.
Now, in one of the reports and interviews done by Robert Kagan, which is the advisor of John McCain, he said that the Palestinians should be transferred to another homeland, and in the sense he was referring to Jordan. Is it a way of trying to shift this conflict from an Israeli-Palestinian conflict to an Arab-Arab conflict?
I'm sure it is. And I think it would be true to say that early on in the 20th century, in the earlier stages of the Zionist movement, many of the Zionists really hoped that they would be able to engage in what they called transfer. And they really hoped that Jordan would welcome these Palestinians and that Jordan would be seen as a Palestinian state, a Palestinian kingdom. Of course, the Jordanians don't particularly want that. More than 50%, maybe nearer 60% of Jordanians at the moment come from Palestine originally.
True.
What I'm afraid of is that Israel is going to go on and on creating facts on the ground, building more settlements around Jerusalem and on the West Bank, in the hope that eventually, if these Palestinian areas do come together to form some kind of Palestinian entity, it will eventually come under the umbrella, the authority of Jordan. I think they're eventually hoping that it would be attached to Jordan. That is the game plan that some of them have had from early on in the 20th century. And this again is where I think the rest of the world, led by America, has to be prepared to stand up to them and say, you can't do this.
We hope so.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
And I think the other point I want to make is that Jerusalem, although it is the center of the conflict, it really could be a city of peace. It really could be a place
where you have all the faiths together.
Exactly. Jews, Christians, Muslims meeting together face to face, understanding each other, living together in harmony, but with sovereignty given to different parts of the city.
Right, Reverend Chapman, thanks a million for joining us on our show, The Inside, and thank you for hosting us here in Cambridge at your place.
أهلا وسهلا, شرفتونا.
Thank you. إذن لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل ودائما من الداخل. إلى اللقاء.